So let's go to our guest. Adam, can you hear us? Adam, yes, we can see you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Perfect.
And
Thank you. I'm just going to ask the technicians in the room to up the volume a little bit. And we're delighted to be joined again by Adam Abdelmoula, the Humanitarian Coordinator for Somalia. So, Adam, please, you have the floor, and then we'll take some questions.
thank you very much, Ishan. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, I am speaking to you again today because Somalia is on the brink of a devastating and widespread hunger and mass starvation that could claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Since the beginning of this year, the drought emergency in Somalia has worsened dramatically, and today we are looking at a looming disaster. The situation is grim. 4 consecutive rainy seasons have failed already, creating the worst drought in Somalia in at least 4 decades. At the same time, food prices have soared and humanitarian assistance remains out of reach for millions of Somalis, as resources to meet their needs remain alarmingly limited. In our analysis, the drought has so far affected 7 million people, displacing over 805,000 from their homes. Recently, some areas received moderate scattered rains, but these were not enough to alleviate the severe drought conditions. There is now a concrete risk that the next rainy season could also be below average, which would mark an unprecedented 5th consecutive failed rainy season. Should these forecasts materialize, the situation will worsen further until mid-2023, and that is at the earliest. Already, 8 areas in Somalia are at increased risk of famine, particularly in the south of the country, in regions where insecurity and conflict make humanitarian access extremely challenging. As we speak, 7.1 million Somalis, and that's close to 50% of the population, are facing crisis-level food insecurity or worse. And that will continue through September at least. And of these, 213,000 people will face catastrophic hunger and starvation, representing a 160% increase since April. Women, children, and the elderly have been particularly hard hit, constituting 82% of all people displaced by drought since January. An estimated 1.5 million children under the age of 5 years face acute malnutrition, including 386,400 who are likely to be severely malnourished. And that is an increase of 55% compared to previous estimates. A malnutrition crisis is likely to worsen as the nutrition situation deteriorates further in the affected areas, and access to people in need remains difficult for humanitarian agencies. The drought has not spared livestock, a major source of livelihoods for Somali families. Since mid-2021, around 3 million heads of livestock have died due to drought. And as expected, the decline in meat and milk production has aggravated the malnutrition situation, especially among young children in pastoral areas. Ladies and gentlemen, Somalia is certainly heading towards a famine if action is not taken right now. Somali families are increasingly unable to cope with the high food prices as local food has become scarce. Moreover, imported food prices have also reached record levels, in part because of supply chain impacts due to the Ukraine crisis. In some parts of the country, food prices have risen by 140 to 160%, leaving poor families hungry and destitute. At the same time, the drought has caused a health emergency. A disease outbreak continues unabated. Since January, over 4,880 suspected cases of acute watery diarrhea / cholera have been reported. Half of these among children under the age of 2. At least 8,700 suspected measles cases, and that is 82% children under age 5 have been also reported. We know that severely malnourished children are 9 times more likely to die of diseases such as acute watery diarrhea and cholera and measles. The latest data shows that mortality rates are reaching high levels in some areas, especially in southern and central Somalia, and that indicates that loss of life is already occurring. We are hearing on the ground that people are losing loved ones, especially children and the elderly. It is painful that the drought is devastating the lives and livelihoods of people whose coping capacities, livelihoods, assets were already eroded by decades of conflict and insecurity, in addition to rising food prices and shortages, climatic shocks, disease outbreaks, the desert locust infestation, and the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why, as the humanitarian focus on saving lives and averting famine, the international community must also invest in sustainable livelihoods, resilience, infrastructure development, climate adaptation, and durable solutions to ensure that those affected by crisis can survive in the future. It is not too late to avert the looming famine. Lives and livelihoods can still be saved, but we need to act immediately. Utilizing available resources, humanitarian agencies reached 2.8 million people between January and April this year. And that is with life-saving and livelihood assistance. Drought assistance and famine prevention programs continue, and I thank our donors and partners for their contributions thus far. The humanitarian community and national and local authorities have scaled up their activities, reorienting responses towards famine prevention and targeting the most vulnerable people in areas of highest need. These interventions by humanitarian partners are limited and hampered by the lack of resources. As we speak, the humanitarian community is witnessing an unprecedented low level of funding. As of yesterday, our humanitarian response plan for 2022 that carries a price tag of $1.5 billion is only remains only 18% funded. 18%. The reality is simply that the scale of assistance currently being delivered and funding from the international community are not sufficient to sustain those most at risk. Partners have shifted to famine prevention activities, but are directing limited resources only to the people and areas where the needs are greatest, and focusing exclusively on life-saving activities. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in beating the drum so that the world can understand the gravity of the crisis in Somalia. I'm calling on the international community to act fast while we still have some hope of preventing widespread famine and disease. With additional resources, we can reach many more people. Without additional resources, more people will definitely die. We cannot wait for a formal declaration of famine to act at the scale. By then, it will be too late. We have been there before. In 2011, severe drought resulted in a famine that killed over 250,000 of people in Somalia, partly because we were slow to act. We must not allow that to happen again. Today, hundreds of thousands of lives are at risk again. I particularly urge donors and partners to urgently front-load pledges and rapidly scale up assistance to the people of Somalia. We must act right now to avert a humanitarian catastrophe. Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much. We'll go to Edie Lederer, Associated Press.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. A couple of questions. Is there any estimate of how many people have already died from lack of food, malnutrition, and to what do you attribute this exceedingly low level of funding for the UN's $1.5 billion appeal?
Thank you.
Well, on your first question, with regard to the estimates of on people who have already lost their lives due to the current conditions, we are still working on those numbers, and I'd be happy to get back to you with the latest numbers that we are working with. On your second question, why are we witnessing this exceedingly low level of funding? As I said during my previous briefing, the crisis in Somalia is overshadowed by many others. And the donors are also facing competing priorities in crisis situation. We were overshadowed previously by the Tigray situation, and before it, the Afghanistan situation, and before that, Yemen. But now Ukraine is occupying center stage. We have not seen this low level of funding in Somalia for over a decade. And that is indicative in part of the fact that Somalia is not on the map as it used to be. And that's why through such press briefings, we are hoping that your efforts to put it back on the radar screen of the donors. So a combination of factors, meeting priorities, donor countries struggling with the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the fact that there isn't enough media coverage of the situation in Somalia, among others, the situation.
And just a quick follow-up on the numbers of people suffering who've died of famine. Are we talking in hundreds, possibly thousands?
We are definitely talking thousands here. Definitely thousands.
Thank you. Margaret Bashir, Voice of America.
Thank you, Mr. Abdelmoula. Just a couple follow-ups on the funding. This 18%, we're already at the half-year mark. Does this mean that some programs are in jeopardy, that you're going to have to close some of your feeding programs or things like that? And could you just explore a bit more for us the impact of the Ukraine situation? Is it that taking center stage from your funding efforts, or is it also, is Somalia also one of the countries that's impacted by the grain import situation, the import-export situation of the grain?
Well, we have already closed down hundreds of feeding centers, as well as health facilities operated by the UN and its partners due to funding shortage. Again, I can give you exact numbers of how many feeding centers we have closed and how many clinics and health facilities operated by the UN and its partners have been closed down because of the lack of funding. I can safely tell you that WFP and its partners have decreased their food and cash handouts to the affected communities by as much as 40% already. And in terms of people, that means out of a caseload, a pre-existing caseload of over 5.1 million, we were able to only reach 2.8 million, and the rest were left out. As the executive director of the World Food Program aptly put it, we are literally in a situation where we are taking food from the hungry to feed the starving. And even within the starving category, we have to prioritize those most in need. With regard to the impact of the Ukraine crisis on Somalia, there are several things that I could point out. One, Somalia used to import more than 50% of its wheat intake from Ukraine, and that has come to a complete halt. The rest was imported from Russia and also came to a halt because of the current. Second, the crisis in Ukraine has affected the fuel prices and disrupted the supply chains. And that translated itself in a spike in all the food prices. And third, due to the Ukraine crisis, globally there has been an increase in oil prices, and that affected countries like Somalia disproportionately because of the fragility of the economy and the dependence on informal import channels. So those are just three factors among many others.
Could I just ask you to clarify? Your audio got a bit garbled in the middle. You said Somalia imports a little over 50% of its wheat from Ukraine, and that's stopped. But then you said something about Russia, but it wasn't clear how much you said they get from Russia.
Yeah, the total import of wheat is 85% from Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine accounts for about 50% and about 35% used to come from Russia. And both of those import sources have come to a complete halt. Also, the Ukraine crisis has led to a disruption in other supply chains. And it contributed to the rise of fuel prices, and that led to a sharp increase in the prices of imported commodities in Somalia that we estimate to be between 140 to 160%.
Thank you.
Thank you for the briefing. I have a question that I guess that I already know the answer to, but I'd still like you to speak about it. What role do you think, or would you attribute to climate change regarding the drought in the last years?
Well, as I keep saying, Somalia is at the forefront of countries that are impacted very, very severely by climate change. And what we see is a clear manifestation of what the, climate change could lead to. Now, as I indicated in my remarks, what we need to do is combine life-saving activities with climate adaptation interventions. These twin afflictions of flash floods and annual droughts is only going to intensify. We have seen an increase of a threefold in the rate of droughts and floods over the past 2 decades compared to the previous 2 decades. The information we have is that by 2080, temperatures are going to rise in Somalia by 3.5 to 4 degrees. And I repeat, 3.5 to 4 degrees. And that would simply mean that the bulk of the Somali territory will become uninhabitable. And that has to be factored in our programming and in our future planning for this part of the world. The immediate impact that we see is this mass starvation, mass migration, and that also fuels local and transboundary conflicts. So all of these have to be taken into account by the international community and by the Somali leaders and planners.
Thank you. Edward, China Central TV.
Hi, Mr. Abdelmoula. This is Deji Xu with China Central Television. I have 2 questions, but I will combine them together. First, you mentioned about the low funding of the money, and you mentioned the severe situation now in Somalia. When you ask the global community to act, is it a little bit too late? And second question, my colleagues mentioned about the situation in Ukraine and also the climate change for Somalia and basically for the Horn of Africa. Which is a bigger problem, the Ukraine conflict or climate change? Thank you.
Well, with regard to the climate change and conflict, let me take that one first. First of all, there is a direct line to be drawn between conflict over dwindling resources across the Sudanic belt that stretches from the Indian Ocean to the Sahel. And you can see that happening in so many places, from what is happening in Mali to what is happening in Darfur to what is happening in Somalia. It's a way of life that is coming to an end. Farmers can no longer farm. Pastoralists have lost their animals, and the remaining communities in areas previously inhabited by both pastoralists and farmers see declining natural resources and intense competition between pastoralists and farmers over those resources. So there is a direct line between conflict and climate change. The other thing is that it is also leading to accelerated urbanization. What we see and what is commonly described by the humanitarians as internal displacement is actually a process of rapid climate-induced urbanization. And that is not easily reversible without the infusion of huge resources invested in climate adaptation. And that is not happening. And that's why year after year, the price tag of the humanitarian interventions keeps rising. And the pledges and the resources available to the humanitarian communities keep declining. So, in short, there are only development solutions to this chronic humanitarian crisis. What we are doing, providing humanitarian assistance, is just addressing the symptoms, not the root causes. But that said, we still need to save as many lives as we can, okay, while we continue to advocate for durable solutions to these afflictions.
Thank you. Dulcie?
Yeah, hi. Just a few things about the grain that that Somalia is unable to access. Can the government go to other countries like Brazil to purchase these foodstuffs? And also, what is the new government doing about this incredible food crisis? There's a new government in place, and the African Union, is it getting involved in this at all? Thanks.
Well, what we have in Somalia is a very fragile government that is mostly dependent on its international partners. Because of decades of conflict, the state is still being rebuilt. We saw a period of political paralysis because of the stalled electoral process. And it's only recently, in the last 2.5 weeks, that we got a new president elected. We don't have a cabinet yet. We're hoping that a new government will be formed in the weeks ahead. The government doesn't have the resources to go for all the country is still awaiting budget support from partners, and if and that money materializes, there will be a renewed hope that we would look for new markets.
Sorry, Adam, we're having some audio problems. If you could just wait 2 seconds, maybe start again talking about the limited resources of the government. Go ahead.
Well, as I said, the government is hugely dependent on budget support from international partners. That budget support was put on hold because of the electoral stalemate. Now the elections are over. We have a president, but we don't have a cabinet yet. We're hoping that the cabinet will be constituted in the weeks ahead. The donors and IFIs have indicated that they will resume budget support. And if that happens, there will be a renewed hope that the government would be able to import some of the grain needs of the country. So that's about that. This is a very, very fragile government so far that's heavily supported by the international community and to a large extent dependent on that support.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Adam, thank you very, very much for this. A very useful update, especially as we speak tomorrow about the greater impact of the war in Ukraine. Thank you, and do keep us posted with more developments. Thank you. Take care, and thank you, everybody. And, sorry, Paulina is briefing. Do not move. Do not change this bat channel. Do not change your seats. I apologize, Paulina. It just...